Okay, Riley, this is for you. We're going to read some more of Hatchet. And there's no pictures in it, so that's okay. So, let's see. I know we may have already read part of this before, but that's okay because we'll recap. Remember, this is Hatchet. It's about Brian, who was flying to visit his father in Canada, and the pilot on his little plane died, and the plane crashed into the water, that lake, and Brian got out of the plane and is now trying to make his way and live in the forest until he can be rescued. So this is the beginning of chapter 6, and Brian is thinking. Okay, ready? 2 years before, he and Terry had been fooling around. Terry is his friend from back home, down near the park, where the city seemed to go to end for a time, and the trees grew thick and came to a small river that went through the park. It was thick there and seemed kind of wild, and they had been joking and making things up, and they pretended they were lost in the woods and talked in the afternoon about what they would do. Of course, they figured there'd be all sorts of goodies like guns and knives and fishing gear and matches so they could hunt and fish and have a fire. I wish you were here, Terry, he thought, with a gun and a knife and some matches. In the park that time, they had decided the best shelter was a lean-to, and Brian set out to make one up. Maybe cover it with some grass or leaves or sticks, he thought, and he started to go down to the lake again, where there were some willows that he could cut down for braces. But it struck him that he ought to find a good place for the lean-to so that he could decide to look around first. He wanted to stay near the lake because he thought the plane, even deep in the water, might show up to somebody flying over, and he didn't want to diminish his chances that he might be found. His eyes fell upon a stone ridge to his left, and he thought at first he should build his shelter against the stone. But before he decided to check out the far side of the ridge, and that's where he got lucky. Using the sun and the fact that it rose in the east and set in the west, he decided that the far side was the northern side of the ridge. At one time, in the far past, it had been scooped up by something, probably a glacier, and this scooping had left a kind of sideways bowl back at the under ledge. It wasn't very deep, not a cave, but it was smooth and made a perfect roof, and he could almost stand under the ledge. He had to hold his head slightly tipped forward and at the front of it to keep it from hitting the stone at the top. Some of the rock that had been scooped out had also been pulverized into glacial action, turning it to sand, and now made a small sand beach that went down to the edge of the water in front to the right of the overhang. It was his first good luck. No, he thought, he had good luck in the landing. This was good luck as well, luck he needed. All he had to do was wall off part of the bowl and leave the opening as a doorway, and he would have the perfect shelter, much stronger than the lean-to, and dry because the overhang made a watertight roof. He crawled back under the ledge and sat. The sand was cool here, and the shade and the coolness felt wonderful on his face, which was already starting to blister, and get especially painful on his forehead with the blister on top of it swelling. Remember, he'd gotten sunburned earlier. He was also still weak. Just the walk around the back of the ridge and the slight climb over the top had left his legs rubbery. It felt good to sit a bit under the shade of the overhang and the cool sand. And now, he thought, if only I had something to eat. Anything. When he had rested a bit, he went back down to the lake and drank a couple of swallowfuls of water. He wasn't all that thirsty, but he thought the water might help take the edge off his hunger. It didn't. Somehow, the cold lake water actually made it worse and sharpened his stomach pains. He thought of dragging in the wood to make the wall and part of the overhang and pick up one piece to pull up. but his arms were too weak. He knew that that just wasn't the crash and the injury to his body and his head. It was also the fact he was weak from hunger. He would have to find something to eat. Before he did anything else, he would have to find something to eat. But what? Brian leaned against the rock and stared out at the lake. What in all of this was there to eat? He was so used to having food, just being there, just always being out there. When he was hungry, he went to the refrigerator or to the stove or sat down to a meal that his mother cooked. Oh, he thought, remembering a meal now. Oh, it was last Thanksgiving, last year, the last Thanksgiving they had as a family before his mother demanded a divorce and his father moved out in the following January. Brian already knew what was going on, but it would cause a breakup and that things may not work out. The meal had been turkey, and they cooked it in the backyard in a barbecue over charcoal with the lid down tight. His father had put hickory chips in the charcoal, and the smell of the cooking turkey and the hickory smoke filled the yard. When his father took the lid off, smiling, the smell that came out was unbelievable. And when they sat down to eat, the meat was wet with juices and rich and had the taste of the smoke in it. He had to stop this. His mouth was full of saliva and his stomach was twisting and growling. What was there to eat? What had he read or seen that told him about food in the wilderness? Hadn't there been something? A show, yes, a show on television about Air Force pilots and some kind of course they took. A survival course. All right, he had the show coming into his thoughts now. The pilots had to live in the desert. They put them down in the desert in Arizona or someplace that they had to live for a week. And they had to find food and water for a week. For water, they made a sheet of plastic into a dew-gathering device, and for food, they ate lizards. That was it. Of course, Brian had lots of water, and there weren't so many lizards in the Canadian woods that he knew of. One of the pilots had used a watch crystal as a magnifying glass to focus the sun and start a fire, so they didn't have to eat the lizards raw. But Brian had a digital watch without a crystal, broken at that. So the show didn't help him that much. Wait, there was one thing. One of the pilots, a woman, had found some kind of beans on a bush, and she had used them with her lizard meat to make a little stew in a tin can she found. Bean lizard stew. There weren't any beans here, but there must be berries. There would have to be berry bushes around. That's what everybody always said. Well, actually, never heard anybody say it, but he felt that it should be true. There would be berry bushes. He stood and moved out of the sand and looked up at the sun. It was still high. He didn't know what time it must be. At home, it would be 1 or 2 if the sun were high. At home, at 1 or 2, his mother would be putting away his lunch dishes and getting ready for her exercise class. No, that would have been yesterday. Today, she would be going to sea. Today was Thursday. Wednesdays was the exercise class, and Thursdays she went to see him. Hot little jets of hate worked into his thoughts, pushed once and moved back. If his mother hadn't begun seeing him and forcing the divorce, Brian wouldn't be here now. He shook his head. He had to stop thinking that kind of thinking. The sun was still high, and that meant that he had some time before darkness to find the berries. He didn't want to be away from his almost thought of as his home, his shelter when it got to be dark. He didn't want to be anywhere in the woods when it came to be dark, and he didn't want to get lost, which was a real problem. All he knew in the world was the lakefront in front of him, and the hill at his back, and the ridge. If he lost sight of them, there was a really good chance he would get turned around and not find his way back. So he started looking for berry bushes, but he kept the lake or the rock ridge in sight at all times. He looked up at the lake shore to the north. For a good distance, perhaps 200 yards, it was fairly clear. There were tall pines, the kind with no limbs until very close to the top, with a gentle breeze sighing in them. It was not too much low brush. 200 yards up there seemed to be a belt of thick, lower brush, starting about 10 or 12 feet high, and that formed a wall he could not see through. It seemed to go on around the lake, thick and lushly green, but he couldn't be sure. If there were berries there, it would be in that brush. He felt as long as he stayed close to the lake, he could keep the water on his right and know where it was. He wouldn't get lost. And when he was done or found berries, he thought he would just turn around so the water was on his left and walk back until he came to the ridge in his shelter. Simple. Keep it simple. I am Brian Robelson. I've been in a plane crash. I'm going to find some food. I'm going to find some berries. He walked slowly, still a bit pained in his joints and weak from hunger, up along the sides of the lake. The trees were full of birds singing ahead of him in the sun. Some he knew and some he didn't. He saw a robin and some kinds of sparrows and a flock of reddish-orange birds with thick beaks. 20 or 30 of them were sitting there on one of the pines. They made so much noise and flew away ahead of him when he walked under the trees. He watched them fly, their colors a bright slash of solid green, and in that way he found the berries. The birds landed in some tall willow-type undergrowth with wide leaves and started jumping and making noise. At first he was too far away to see what they were doing, but their color drew him in and towards them, keeping the lake in sight to his right. And when he got closer, he saw they were eating berries. He could not believe it was that easy. It was as if the birds had taken them right to the berries. The slender branches went up about 20 feet and were heavy, drooping with clusters of bright red berries. They were half as big as grapes, but hung in bunches, much like grapes. And when Brian saw them, glistening red in the sunlight, he almost yelled. His pace quickened, and he saw them in moments scatter the birds, grab the branches, strip them to fill his mouth with berries. He almost spit them out. It wasn't that they were bitter so much as they lacked any sweetness. They had a tart flavor and left his mouth feeling dry. And they were like cherries in that they had large pits, which made them hard to chew. But there was such a hunger in him, such an emptiness, that he could not stop and kept stripping the branches and eating the berries by the handful, grabbing and jabbing them into his mouth and swallowing them, pits and all. Now, really you can't do that because a lot of times the things that look like berries and stuff outside can be poisonous. So we'll have to see what happens to Brian, but don't ever eat berries off of a tree outside. He could not stop, and when at last his stomach was full, he was still hungry. 2 days without food must have shrunken his stomach. But the drive of hunger was still there. Thinking of the birds and how they would come back into the berries when he left, he made a carrying pouch of his torn windbreaker and kept picking. Finally, when he judged he had close to 4 pounds in the jacket, he stopped and went back to his camp by the ridge. Now, he thought, now I have some food and I can do something about fixing this place up. He glanced at the sun and saw he had some time before it was dark. If only I had matches, he thought. Looking ruefully at the beach and the lakeside, there was driftwood everywhere, not to mention dead and drying wood all over the hill, and the dead dry branches hanging from the trees, all firewood, and no matches. How did they used to do it? He thought. Rub 2 sticks together? He tucked the berries into the pouch back under the overhang in the cool shade and found a couple of sticks. After 10 minutes of rubbing, he felt the sticks, and they were almost cool to the touch. Not that, he thought. He didn't want to do fire that way. He threw the sticks down in disgust, so no fire. But he could still fix a shelter and make it, here's the word, safer, came to mind. He didn't know why, but more livable. Kind of close in, he thought, I'll close it in a bit. He started dragging sticks up from the lake and pulling long dead branches down from the hill, never getting out of sight of the water in the ridge. These were interlaced with these he interlaced and wove a wall across the opening of the front of the rock. It took over 2 hours, and he had to stop several times because he still felt a bit weak, and once because he felt a strange new twinge in his stomach. A tightening, rolling. Too many berries, he thought. I ate too many of them. But it was gone soon, and he kept working until the entire front of the overhang was covered, save for a small opening at the right end nearest the lake. The doorway was about 3 feet, and when he went into it, he found a room almost 15 feet long and 8 to 10 feet deep, with a rock wall sloping down at the rear. Good, he said, noting. Good. Outside, the sun was going down, finally, and in the initial coolness, the mosquitoes came out again and clouded in on him. They were thick, terrible, if not quite as bad as in the morning, and he kept brushing them off his arms, and still he couldn't stand it. And then he dumped the berries and put the torn windbreaker on. At least the sleeves covered his arms. Wrapped in the jacket, with the darkness coming down fast now, he crawled back in under the rocks and huddled and tried to find a place to sleep. He was deeply tired and still aching some, but sleep was slow coming and did not finally settle in until the evening cooled down and the night air was cool too and the mosquitoes slowed down. Then, at last, with his stomach turning on the berries, Brian went to sleep. Okay, that's the end of chapter 6. When you're ready, we'll do chapter 7. Hope you enjoyed it, Riley. Talk to y'all later. Love you. Bye.